Okay, so now I want to talk about how we call methods and the different ways of calling methods and binding references to methods. And that all sounds very abstract and weird, so let's just dive right in and give an example. So whenever we deal with Angular and the front end, we always have this situation where the front end gets a method that it can call, and then either you write the method right on it. So let's say we have a delete method. Let's delete this out, this line. So let's say we have a delete method on the VM, and we want to call it from the front end. We want to call it from the HTML in an ng-click or whatever. There's one way to declare it, which is by inline declaring a method, right, and doing something. So console log delete. Another way of doing it is with a reference. So we would hoist, in our case, is what we would do. We would hoist a method and, let's call it my delete or whatever, to not have any naming conflicts. And then we would pass in a reference to that method, right? That's another way of doing it. So this is only a reference to another method. And that's really the shortest way, and this is a not so short way. So this is something that we've abandoned to always create these methods inline. Because it's not so clean from a code perspective, and it's not as reusable, because then in order to actually call this VM delete from other places, you would always have to call the VM delete. You can't actually call the method as it is declared in this controller. But what, however, if you need some sort of parameters from now it gets a little complicated, but let's say okay, let's go into the job service. Let's do it with the job service instead. I think that makes more sense. Because once we're in the service situation, you can more clearly see what I'm talking about. So let's say I'm declaring a new method in here, my method, and let's just paste it in here. And now we want to, on the VM, put a reference to our job service dot my method, right? Now, all of a sudden, when we call this VM my method somewhere, preferably in the HTML context, but it could also be from inside the controller, then it is always that this method is being called. Yeah, this right here, the job service my method is being called. When that is the case, any parameter you pass into this method when you call it are passed on to the my method. So for example, let's say somewhere I would then call VM my method with some text and hello world. We would have the parameters all of a sudden some text and hello text or whatever we would call it. Yeah. So now we can expect that we actually get two texts based on the way we call it. But what happens if we want to pass in variables that we don't know when we call it? What I mean is, let's go, for example, where am I here? I'm on the right sidebar. So let's open the job right sidebar and put in a button here, ng click, and then VM my method. So now we're calling our method, and now we don't call it with any parameters. And we want to put in, I don't know, maybe we don't even want to put anything, but we still want this thing to know which job we're referring to. So, we want to know what job we're dealing with here to do something with it. For instance, to set the system status to 1 or something. Let's say that's what we have to do in this my method. But we're not passing in this job. What we could do is we could always pass in, the job from the VM because we have it, but what if it's not on the VM? What if we can't actually put it in here? One example of that would be, let's go back here. Well, something that's not on the VM, I don't know. What if we want to put in, I can't come up with anything. This state or something, the current state name. That's not typically something that's on the VM. So I want to have the current state name. and the VM job. So cur state name and the VM job. And I don't want to have to go ahead and now bind the current state name onto the VM in order to be able to pass it in from this call here. Because as we learned, right, in order to be able to have these parameters, we need to pass them in when we call this method. Or is that so? Or is there another way? And that's where binding comes in. So what you can do, instead of just putting in a reference like this, well, one way would be also to actually declare a little method, just a short method that the only thing it does is it passes any parameter that we have onto the my method, but also at the same time puts in the state.current and the VM job, right? This is one way to always make sure that these two parameters are given. And let's say then we have a type here as well, and then we would also put in the type, and then we could add the type from the front end. So now we have a discrepancy. We have a discrepancy here. This method here, so I don't know, type HTML or whatever, this method here only passes in one single parameter. That single parameter is passed on to the my method as a last parameter, and then this one always assumes that you get 3. So that's one way of doing it, and always passing in, state, current, and VM job. But again, that's not so pretty, right? Because it's 3 lines. And we lose this whole idea of binding one method to another and having just the reference. And this other syntax makes it easy, but it's a little confusing to start with. What you do, instead of calling the method, because you may not do this. I mean, just calling the method like this, you may not do. Because, quiz question, anybody knows the answer? What happens if you call the method like this? If you declare it like so on this line of code? What happens then?
It's executed and the return value is bound to my method.
Yes, 100 points to you. Exactly right. So that's not what we want. We want to be able to, on pressing the button that executes my method, to execute the job service method. So that's exactly not what we want, that initialization of the controller, that all of a sudden this method is being called. That's, that doesn't interest us. So here comes in the .bind. Any method, any function in JavaScript has this prototype method. A prototype method, if you know it, I don't know if you know it, is a method that is implicit on something. And any function has this implicit prototype method that is shared across, all functions basically, and always does the same thing. And what you do here is very important. The amount of arguments that you pass in here is extremely important, because first argument is the context. Let's just put it like this for now so we understand. This is the context, and I'll explain a little bit what that means. The second one is the param1. The next one is the param2. And any parameter that is being added when calling this method. So now if I would call this method, VM method, with just express or whatever, right, some type, then that means it is added as a third parameter. That's very important. So when binding a method like so, you actually only put in the reference to that method, but you give it some stuff beforehand. You give it some information so that when calling this method, you only have to supply the one thing that can actually change each time you call it, like a type from the front end or something similar. So now, and I'll explain to you in a second what these parameters mean, but now what we can do is we can actually just execute it like so, and with this one single line, it then calls this method. And then what it does is it supplies the current state name, or parameter 1 is being filled into this parameter, parameter 2 is being filled in this parameter, and the single parameter that's being supplied here is passed on as the third parameter. And any subsequent parameters would be added, 4th, 5th, 6th. So 1 and then true and whatever else you want to put in there would be subsequent, right? So then int and bool and whatever else we want to put in. So so that's really, really important, that when you use bind, everything when calling, is added at the end. So then, in order to initialize these two things, we can just go ahead and set state.current, right, for the current state name, and then the VM.job, we just have to make sure that it's actually assigned somewhere. So I want to do that in the init method or wherever we are sure that there's something on this, because this will not be re-added every time the my method is executed. That's important. It is only done on initial binding. So when this line of code is executed, the line 45 of this controller, that's when it needs to know what is in the state current and what is in the VM job. Then it needs to have the correct references already in the in memory. If it doesn't, then these are undefined and they will never be populated after the fact. Not when calling this method. The only thing that changes when calling the method is this right here. And now comes the last weird first parameter in the bind method. And that's like a big question mark for many programmers because it's very confusing. But what that is, that's this. I don't know if you've played around with this very much with methods, but this is really, it's the context from where the method was called. And that's confusing in many ways, because if you call it from inside the controller, but you call it as such, job service, open close parentheses, then that doesn't mean the context is the job controller. That means the context is the job service. So when using this, you are actually able to access other methods as it is in this return statement. So you could call this dot init job pages, open close parentheses or something. And that's important, when you make classes, you always have this instance thing. It's like you have a class and then you create instances off of that class. And once you have these instances, the methods on there are not static anymore. In this case, this job service, it's also lowercase and everything, these are all static. These are, in Java lingo or OO lingo, these are all static methods, meaning they don't influence each other. They don't actually need the this context. But in cases where you are actually using binding together with these methods that are this aware, that have a this context, for instance, by this current job thingy. What if I want to access this current job up here, but then I muck up the this? I could, if I screw it up, if I put something wrong in this, or if this is somehow faulty, then the current job is all of a sudden not set. But let me tell you like this: if you call job service my method, you always have this correct. Because when you call job service my method, it's almost like, calling a method on an instance. And then it is this job service that is your context, your instance. However, if you call job service my method bind, it loses the context. And then what becomes this is, or different, if we do it like this, if we write it just as a reference, job service my method, then this becomes whatever you call it from. So then this is some weird, I think, like event from this button click. It becomes like some weird HTML jQuery weird event thing. That becomes this all of a sudden. And I have ripped out my hair on multiple occasions because I was like, what's happening here? What's going on with this? And so when you just pass in a reference to a method that uses the this context, you're very, very likely to screw things up and things don't work as expected anymore. However, binding allows you to tell it, to tell the binding situation that when it is being called, what is the this supposed to be then? And so that usually what you will see in the code is that it just repeats the instance. And that fixes this. Because then you tell it, when you execute the method, treat the job service as the current context, pass in as first parameter the current state, pass in as second parameter the job, and then anything else that is being done when the method is being called, like in the bottom, this type here. And all of a sudden, it makes sense, that this first binding parameter fixes this, the first state fixes, the first parameter current state, the VM job is the job, and the type is the type that you provide. If, however, you don't need this, then you can just put in a null here, and then you're also good. And that's usually what we do with static methods that we bind like so, because we don't need this, and and then it's fine to just put a null or undefined, just the shortest thing you can come up with. Empty strings maybe not so pretty because it's maybe confusing or something. Usually I go with either the current instance, so job service or whichever service we're on, or null to indicate that it's a static method and that we don't need a context. But yeah, so that's bind. And another way also, so this is the equivalent of of this in a way, or not the equivalent, but they're related. A reference is related to bind, and a job service dot my method being called is equivalent to dot call, and that's also something you can do. So that's also a prototype method on each function. It's the call method, and in the call method, I think it's the same logic. You can provide this context, and then the other you can provide more information. However, it's not so typical, because you don't need to usually define this context, and also any parameter you supply here, say put a null here, it's just you supply it here anyway. So the call method makes much less sense, and thus it occurs, much less frequent. But the bind method is actually very useful for cases like where you want to pre-bind some variables to the method.